Welcome to today's edition of the IntoTexas AI podcast. It's your look at AI news and trends impacting Texas. I'm your host, Shannon Belew. Let's get started. Sometimes there are unexpected companies that pop up under AI news. Celanese, the Irving-based materials and chemical company, is one of those. It announced this week that it's getting into humanoid robot joints, not building the robots and not developing the AI that controls them. The company instead has partnered with Hong Kong-based Vigor Precision to develop lightweight plastic components for the joints inside humanoid robots. The goal is to replace traditional metals with high-performance plastics and reduce the weight of those joint modules by as much as 30%. And that caught my attention for a reason that has, very little to do with plastic. There's a lot of money and a lot of engineering talent from across all different types of industries that are stepping into the world of physical AI. And if that market develops the way investors clearly believe it might, a company like Celanese suddenly makes sense as part of the broader AI story. Today, we're taking a deeper look at the expansion of and opportunity for AI's place in the physical world. It's a topic we've touched on previously, but that one was more around security and how AI is being used to aid law enforcement, from robo-dogs to sensors and cameras. But as we're discovering, the role of artificial intelligence is rapidly expanding as we think about how it gets applied to the many ways we operate inside the physical world. The numbers behind the market growth. According to PitchBook data, physical AI startups raised a record $16.3 billion across 492 deals in the first quarter of 2026 alone. It was the strongest quarter on record for both dollars invested and the number of deals as reported by Business Insider. That's the number that really got me digging into this a bit further, because we've certainly heard plenty about robots before, and at IntoTexas AI, we've discussed robotics, industrial automation, and certainly autonomous vehicles a good bit. What's changing, or maybe just getting more attention, is the intelligence we can put inside those machines. And that's where we get into two terms you're probably going to hear a lot more often: physical AI and embodied AI. The terminology is still a little messy. There doesn't seem to be one universally accepted definition that everyone in technology and academia and business is using exactly the same way, or at least not that I could find. Reason and act in the physical world. So that can include robots, autonomous vehicles, cameras, and other intelligent machines. Embodied AI tends to put more emphasis on the fact that the intelligence has a physical form and learns or operates through that connection between perception and action. NVIDIA itself describes embodied AI as the integration of artificial intelligence into physical systems that can interact with the physical world. All right, for purposes of this conversation, I think there's probably an easier way to think about it. I'm going to use the term physical AI as the broader umbrella. AI moving beyond software and into machines that can do something in the real world. And I'll use the term embodied AI when the body itself is an important part of how that intelligence perceives, learns, and acts. A chatbot can tell you how to pick up a box. An embodied AI system has to find the box, figure out where it is in the space, determine how to grip it, and understand how heavy it might be, or to be able to move it without dropping it, or notice if a person suddenly walks in front of it and adjust what it does next. Now, for many of us, that sounds almost ridiculously simple because humans do those things without thinking about them typically. For a machine, it's an entirely different AI problem. And right now, people are trying very hard to put a dollar value on where that type of problem might lead. So let's get back to the numbers. The embodied AI market was estimated at about $4.4 billion in 2025, with projections that it could reach $23 billion by 2030. And that's according to the global research and advisory firm Markets and Markets. Now, that staggering 5-year market escalation represents annual growth of about 39. Current estimate from Research and Markets addresses what it calls the physical AI market, putting it at only about 1.5 billion in 2026, so this year, and then growing to roughly $15.2 billion by 2032. Then, if you take another look at even more numbers, these are from Morgan Stanley. They take a view that's a bit more further out. And they estimate that the humanoid economy, right? Humanoid economy could exceed $5 trillion by 2050. So that's including not just the robots themselves, but the supply chains, or the repair, maintenance, the support systems around them. It's, again, that entire economy is how they're measuring it. Now, all of those numbers sound dramatically different, but I don't think we should treat them as competing forecasts because really they're measuring different markets over very different periods of time. In fact, if you were to simply extend that 39% growth rate that we mentioned earlier for Markets and Markets forecast, and you take that out to 2050, you'd end up with a market north of $16 trillion. Now, I don't think you should actually do it that way. And really, the bigger takeaway is that the numbers around physical and embodied AI are still highly dependent on what researchers include in the category, how far into the future they're willing to project, and what assumptions they're making about adoption. So I'm really less interested in picking the biggest forecast, right? I just want to give you an idea of the types of numbers of projections that are out there today about where this market size could grow to. And we recognize through doing this, right, that there is a sizable opportunity moving forward, right? That's really the point. And in fact, the number that I find most compelling right now is the $16.3 billion that investors have actually put into physical AI startups in the first quarter of this year, because that's not about predictions. It's about right now, right? It's what's happening, the capital already moving into the market today. Now, we do get another useful data point. It came out just this week, in fact, that suggests some of that money is beginning to turn into actual product moving into the market. So this comes from Counterpoint Research, which says that the global humanoid robot shipments topped 22,000 units in the first half of this year, 2026. That's up nearly 300% from a year earlier. Now, it expects shipments to surpass 50,000 for the full year of 2026. Now, 50,000 robots is still a very small market compared with more mature industrial technologies. But Counterpoint says more pilot projects are moving toward broader commercial development and deployment, with industrial and service applications expected to become increasingly important sources of demand. So we now have two different kinds of evidence, if you will, pointing in the same direction, right? We've got record investment going into physical AI, those startups, and you've got a young humanoid market beginning to ship more actual units into the real world today. Now, that brings me back to Texas. Physical AI making moves in the Lone Star State. Companies such as Celanese sit inside that broader humanoid economy that Morgan Stanley has defined. As I mentioned, the company is typically known for its expertise in specialty materials and chemicals and is a global supplier of high-performance engineering plastics. The problem Celanese and its now strategic partner Vigor are trying to solve is pretty practical. Traditional metal joint modules add weight. And that affects how long a humanoid can operate, how quickly it can respond, and how much it can carry. If you think about it, it's much like our own human joints and all the conditions that impact those over time, right? So we're really talking about the same thing. Now, this new partnership is aimed at using engineered plastics to cut a joint module weight by more than 30%. We mentioned that was the targeted goal through this. Now, for some of you who are familiar with these markets, that may sound very simply like a component level engineering story because, it is. But those component level problems are exactly what have to be solved if humanoids are going to move from just really strong demonstrations of work into very active machines that can work for hours in commercial settings. And I think it's a good example of why the physical AI economy reaches beyond companies we would normally not label as AI companies. Materials, gears, sensors, batteries, manufacturing, and maintenance all become part of this ecosystem if these machines scale. So, when you think of embodied AI, then maybe one of the most obvious examples of what we have in Texas right now may be Austin based Apptronic, which we've actually touched on before on this podcast. But I want to bring them back into this conversation for a slightly different reason. In June of this year, Apptronic opened an expanded facility in Austin called Robot Park. It's nearly 90,000 square feet, and the company is using it to train its Apollo humanoid robots on real world tasks. The data those robots generate is also being used in Apptronic's work with Google DeepMind and its Gemini robotics model. So let's think about what that means. One of the great advantages of large language models, one of the great advantages they had really was access to an almost unimaginable amount of existing digital information, right? That's what they're pulling from. The physical world doesn't come packaged that same way. If we want a robot to function inside a factory, for example, or a warehouse, or eventually in our home, it has to learn about objects and movement, force and distance, and all of the unexpected things that could happen when machines operate around humans and in a real world environment. So, Apptronic is creating this physical experience as training data. Earlier this year, the company raised another $520 million at a valuation of about $5 billion with investors that included Google and Mercedes Benz. Apptronic is initially targeting manufacturing and logistics and already has commercial agreements with Mercedes Benz and GXO. And just this week, Austin picked up another piece of that ecosystem, this time on the manufacturing side. So let's talk about this announcement that just recently came out. Governor Abbott actually announced this along with Amazon, who confirmed plans for a new advanced robotics manufacturing facility in Austin that is expected to create between 300 and 500 manufacturing and engineering jobs. The company says the site will produce robotics systems used across its fulfillment network. And it pointed to Austin's engineering workforce, the universities, and already existing community partnerships as reasons for choosing Austin as the location for this new facility. Amazon, if you're not aware, already manufactures robotic systems at facilities in Massachusetts, where its robotics business grew out of the acquisition of Kiva Systems. So I think it's actually notable that Amazon is now choosing a Texas location as the next place to expand that manufacturing footprint. Amazon previously noted that it has developed, produced, and deployed more than 1 million robots across its operations network. So that means we're gaining one of the world's largest existing producers and users of industrial robotics. And I think that's a great sign that Texas is actively attracting more of the production side of physical AI. Now, you put that alongside companies like Aptronic that are training humanoids in that same Austin market, and then you put those alongside companies like Celanese, who are supplying materials into the humanoid ecosystem, again from Irving. And the Texas opportunity definitely begins to broaden. Now, there's also another Texas company that's focused on improving logistics and warehouse automation. Plus One Robotics, which is headquartered in San Antonio, develops AI powered vision systems for warehouse automation. So, machines doing things like sorting and picking and moving packages. The company says its systems have now completed more than 1.5 billion individual picks across 15 countries. What I find particularly interesting about Plus One is not just the robot, it's what happens when the robot doesn't know what to do. Plus One uses what it calls supervised autonomy. If the AI runs into an unusual object or another situation that it can't resolve confidently and immediately, a human can remotely step in, help resolve the problem, and keep the system moving. Now, that may not look or sound as futuristic as a humanoid robot, but from a business standpoint, it's really interesting. The goal isn't necessarily to remove the human from every decision being made, right? The goal is to let the machine handle the enormous volume of routine decisions and bring the human back in when human judgment is actually needed. In fact, CEO and founder of Plus One Robotics, Eric Neves, has discussed the company's position about the relationship between humans and robots. He says, robots work, people rule. And in an interview on the Insights and Automation podcast, Neves explains that that's what he considers, quote, the right relationship. He's talked about how we do need robots to do the work that we don't want to do, but people are needed for the judgment, from programming to oversight. Now, that sounds a lot like conversations we've already had about AI agents in office environments, except now the agent has a robot attached to it. All right, Texas has yet another version of this story playing out in a little bit of a different environment. Austin based Saronic is building autonomous vessels. It's another company that we've continued to watch and discuss here at IntoTexas AI. Its systems combine hardware, software, and artificial intelligence so that vessels can perceive conditions and navigate and coordinate and carry out various maritime missions. Its Echelon platform is designed to manage not only an individual autonomous vessel, but multiple vessels operating together, including capabilities around edge AI and collaborative behavior. Now, we're a long way from a humanoid robot moving a box when we talk about these large vessels, but we're still talking about the same underlying shift, right? AI isn't simply recommending an action to a person. It's connected to a physical system capable of taking the actual action. And we've had another reminder that in the defense market recently with Shield AI, which has operations out of Frisco. It announced this month that its HiveMind autonomy system coordinated 3 unmanned aircraft during a demonstration in Taiwan. The aircraft were able to divide up a search area and conduct the mission fully autonomously while working around a designated no-fly zone. That example raises a much bigger set of questions around autonomy, safety, and how much decision making we ultimately want machines to have in certain conditions and environments. Those questions deserve their own conversation. So we're not going to get into that here, but it is again another example of a company in Texas that's looking at how they're bringing AI into the physical world and what those possibilities could mean. So again, it's just another indication that when we talk about physical AI, we're not talking about one industry, right? These are things that span across multiple industries. And I think that autonomous vehicles also belong in this conversation too. So let's discuss what's next with Waymo, and then we're going to get into Flock and the trust and governance conversation a little bit. Since we've covered Waymo quite a bit already, I'll keep this update brief. On August the 4th, Waymo opened its fully autonomous Dallas ride service to the general public. That's following its initial rollout period where 150,000 people used the service. That was part of its test phase in the Dallas area. Now, there are still limitations on routes in the DFW area, which are mainly confined to Dallas city streets. The company is, however, testing airport rides. Right now, it's to and from Love Field, but they're also preparing for fully autonomous freeway testing across Dallas. In respect to autonomous vehicles, we've definitely reached the point where at least one form of physical AI is no longer theoretical, right? We can download the app, we can call the car and ride in it. That insertion of AI into our physical world can also lead to some real world headaches and pressure points, some occasional and more than occasional public scrutiny, and the realization that current laws and regulations may need to change as a result of AI entering our physical world. Waymo, again, they've already faced intense public scrutiny and federal investigations in Texas due to a range of issues from, traffic infractions to interference with emergency responders. The company has also had to recall vehicles when real road and weather conditions exposed software glitches. We heard a lot about that in the news over the past few months. Now, the robo-taxis often pause service during flooding and other weather-related events because of that learning of those environmental conditions that impact safety. And that's a good transition to the subject of public trust. Physical AI, like almost every AI use case, eventually brings us back to questions about data, privacy, and governance, and specifically how much authority we want to give technology. And that leads us to an update on a story we covered recently involving Flock safety cameras. They're located across Texas, particularly in the DFW area. Dallas now has more than 650 Flock cameras installed. And as a reminder, if you're not aware, Flock is the company that sells the AI powered license plate tracking technology in cameras. Now, when we first talked about Flock here on the IntoTexas AI podcast, we did highlight a lot of the public safety benefits that are expected from the use of this type of technology in our world, right? But at the same time, we also raised questions about who can search all of that vehicle data. How long should that data be kept? And how broadly it can be shared, and whether these growing camera networks risk becoming something much closer to mass surveillance. Since then, those questions have become considerably less theoretical. Police, like those in Dallas, continue to defend the cameras as useful crime fighting tools, while privacy advocates have become increasingly vocal about the amount of vehicle data being collected and how broadly that information can potentially be searched. In fact, in nearby Carrollton, residents have organized an effort asking the city to remove its Flock cameras altogether. And this is becoming a statewide issue. The Texas Tribune reported earlier this month that more than 200 local law enforcement agencies have data sharing agreements with the Texas Department of Public Safety. Advocacy groups tracking the network estimate there may now be more than 10,000 Flock cameras across the state, although the exact number isn't publicly known. Now, some Texas communities are starting to push back. Hood County is an example. They voted to end its Flock contract. And just last week, county officials voted to unplug and cover the remaining cameras until they could be removed. Now, that came after similar decisions elsewhere in Texas, including Austin and Bandera. And there have been real cases of misuse documented. Several Houston area law enforcement agencies have investigated allegations that officers improperly used flock searches. Just this month, Deer Park disciplined an officer after an internal audit found misuse of the system. Baytown has also been conducting internal and criminal investigations involving alleged misuse by a former officer. And, again, these are all documented incidents, cases. They've been in the news quite a bit in the last couple of weeks. And the company continues to respond to all of these concerns. In fact, on August the 13th, Flock, the company, announced a series of changes intended to strengthen privacy and accountability. Flock is changing its recommended default retention period for license plate data from the default of 30 days to 7 days, although existing customers can retain the periods that were already approved in their communities. Now, it is also making its automated misuse detection system mandatory for law enforcement customers by the end of this year and will require that any searches of that data be connected to actual existing case codes. New controls will also allow communities to limit what kinds of investigations that outside agencies can use their camera data for. So, yes, I think these are all meaningful changes. But at the same time, critics continue to argue that they still don't answer the larger question of whether police should be able to search such a large network of vehicle location information without judicial oversight. And that debate has now reached Congress. U.S. Representative Keith Self of McKinney introduced legislation in July that would require federal law enforcement agencies to obtain a warrant before accessing surveillance data collected by state and local systems, such as automated license plate readers. But there's also another development that came out this week that I think adds another layer of interest to this story. Wired reported that Flock is now testing a much broader AI investigation system called OS Investigate. According to the reporting, the system can combine camera information with police case files, dispatch records, and other databases, and then use AI to look for patterns in where vehicles travel and which other vehicles appear around them. Flock says the product is completely separate from its license plate reader technology and is still in development and is currently being tested with a small group of law enforcement partners, again, according to the reporting. But I think this illustrates exactly why this conversation is getting bigger. The question isn't simply whether a camera should be able to read a license plate. It's what happens when thousands of sensors operating in the physical world become connected to increasingly sophisticated AI that can search, correlate, and interpret everything that those sensors see. So there are very legitimate public safety applications for that technology. Police departments point to stolen vehicles, missing people, and other serious crimes where these systems can legitimately, again, help investigators move much faster to solve these crimes. At the same time, the more capable the technology becomes, the more important the rules around access, oversight, and appropriate use become. And right now, Texas is very much part of the debate over where those lines should be drawn. Perhaps that takes us back to the philosophy I shared earlier from Plus One Robotics. Robots work, people rule. One thing I feel confident in is that the relationship between AI and humans is going to get increasingly complex. The second thing I have great confidence in is there will be continued market opportunity for companies that are able to develop, deliver, and support AI integration with the physical world, whether that's through robotics and humanoids or other parts of the ecosystem. And as we've seen with other areas of AI, that increasing role of physical AI and embodied AI potentially broadens the Texas opportunity with it. So, from a company like Celanese, which isn't typically considered an AI company, to Aptronic building humanoids, and then look at Amazon manufacturing complete robotics systems in Austin. Well, there is space for more Texas companies to capture a piece of this growing market and certainly to bring more of that market into Texas. That's all for today's episode of the IntoTexas AI podcast. As always, I really appreciate that you take your time to listen or watch. And I do ask, if you're enjoying what you're hearing, please subscribe so that I can continue to give you insights and some of the deep dives into the latest news about how AI truly is reshaping Texas. I'm your host, Shannon Belew, and that's today's episode of the IntoTexas AI podcast. I'll see you next time.